You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. In this episode, I sat down with Admiral Sir Antony David Radakin. He is the most senior officer in the British Armed Forces, the professional head of the British Armed Forces, our equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's also had some very cool titles in his career, even cooler than that. He was the first Sea Lord, the head of the Naval Service. He also has another very cool title that I didn't get a chance to ask him about, but I just found on his Wikipedia page, the Lord High Constable of England. America, we need to step it up with our cool titles. We really need to do better. Anyway, we had a fantastic conversation during his recent visit to Washington, D.C., and I hope you enjoy the conversation. So what brings you to town?
So I'm here, part of a regular visits to Washington and catch up with your chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, and I'm very fortunate that I'm also going to receive an award, a Legion of Merit, tomorrow.
Congratulations.
So, well, thank you. And congratulations to you. 10 years and a big USMC sword, I hear.
Yeah. Frank Hoffman unexpectedly gave me a big sword on our 10th anniversary party. Very kind of him. I'm a sword owner now, which is something I thought I'd never say. This is probably the capital I would imagine you have gone to the most since becoming Chief of Defense Staff. Is that fair or is that not right?
It's here alongside Kyiv, and then the other one is Brussels, because we go to Brussels on a regular basis, Belgium and Brussels on a regular basis as part of the NATO Chiefs of Defence. So it's those three in terms of the most regular visits.
Do you have any favorite DC watering holes that you like to visit when you're in town?
I've got to be careful here because I don't know. I'm going to be
issue. Yeah.
So I was taken to George's bar. And George, the owner, took me to the top of his bar, which has a fantastic overview of the memorial part of the White House and so on. So that's my current favorite.
You know, the old Chinese curse they say is, may you live in interesting times. You've been CDS during very interesting times. Maybe we could start with Ukraine. Ukraine has a lot of backers, but Britain is probably most prominent among them, second to the United States in many ways. What has that been like from your perspective?
So I think professionally it's been the most rewarding piece in my career, and that's over 35 years. I think it's the clarity about what we're all trying to do to assist Ukraine and to ensure that Russia is seen to fail. And that is both personal and professional. It's the relationship with General Zaluzhny. It's your relationship with fellow chiefs, so whether it's General Milley, the EUCOM commander and SACEUR, Chris Cavoli, and then all those European chiefs and then others. And the clarity that we have in terms of political direction, that our politicians are going to see this through and continue to support Ukraine, and that Russia is losing and has lost this war. It was a catastrophic mistake, and Ukraine is winning, and we have to keep on supporting Ukraine and ensure that victory for Ukraine and what Ukraine is aspiring to achieve becomes absolutely manifest.
What's your view of how the current offensive is unfolding?
So I think the important piece is the way that this year the international community have come together to build up the forces to give Ukraine that increased combat power. That really has been the dominant part in the first half of this year, and an extraordinary commitment of international effort, both in terms of equipment and ammunition. Then a Ukraine that has continued its journey of retaking occupied territory. And if you look back to last year, Ukraine has taken over 50% of the territory that Russia initially occupied, and now it's taking back more territory. And I think we've got to be very careful of rushing to easy judgments about that there was somehow a golden timeline. This is visceral war where time and achievements get adjusted. And what you're seeing is a Ukraine that is adapting to some tough Russian defenses, but has got the initiative and is grinding through and making progress. And then my other piece would be, I'm cautious about, at one level, it's understandable, this focus on the counteroffensive. But the risk is that it gets so tactical and that we are in danger of briefing our leaders on a daily, weekly basis about the number of kilometers that Ukraine has achieved. And we skip over the fact that Russia's objectives have been a total failure. They failed to subjugate Ukraine. That's what this was all about. The opposite has happened, that Ukraine is stronger now as a nation and has the resolve and the will to fight and the determination to be a sovereign power and an ambition to be part of a European community, both within the EU and NATO. And Russia has provoked all of that, and it has enabled NATO to strengthen and to grow in size, particularly with Finland and Sweden, NATO to stiffen its resolve and increase its investment. And then Russia is also suffering economically and diplomatically. And this is a Russia that is diminished and continues to be diminishing. And we've got to analyze the counteroffensive, and we can go into the next stage and the winter and so on. But can we see it in the round across the whole piece? Because that's what it feels like in Kyiv. Because you not only have to win this fight, but you also have to continue running your nation, and you have to create a path for your nation to be even more prosperous in the future, and for people to come back that have left, and to secure that future for your country.
One of my favorite books written in the last decade or so is Cathal Nolan's The Allure of Battle. Beautifully written book. I'm not sure if you've read it, but the basic argument is something that I think you know well, and that your remarks just made me think about, is that we're often in search, when we're looking at war or planning war or commenting on war, for that decisive battle that will decide the outcome of the war, when in reality wars between large powers tend to be decided by endurance, who can stay in the fight the longest, force preservation, finances, logistics, supply. And it's important to be clear-eyed about how the offensive's going, but I think, and Mike Kaufman has said this, and many others have said this, is it's also important to look at how well-positioned each country is to sustain the war beyond this offensive, and where that takes them over the long term. And that's what your remarks reminded me of.
I completely agree. And the other quite often it's the military that win battles, but it's economics and that sustainability that tends to win wars. And I'm sure this is no different in that sense.
I know Britain has been one of the countries very involved in helping Ukraine come up with its war plans and battle plans. What have you learned in that process, and what is that like when you're sitting in those meetings and your staff is sitting in those meetings?
So at the big level, I think this has reaffirmed two fundamental policies for the UK. The first one is collective security. So what keeps the UK safe? It's being in NATO and the world's largest, most powerful military alliance. The second policy is being a nuclear nation gives you, again, a further degree of assuredness. And if you are not a nuclear nation, you probably want to be part of a nuclear alliance. So I think at the higher level, it's affirmation of those things. At the lower level, I think it's, again, a lot of it to me is affirmation of things that we probably knew, but it feels even stronger the closer you get to it. So some of it is the friction of war, and whether that is how do you pull together a whole bunch of nations in order to be able to help Ukraine, and how do you organize that, and a massive effort, and how do you do it in a way that the country can absorb that and it's useful to them? How do you when you look at the start of the counteroffensive, there were points where Ukraine wanted to assure itself of a bit more equipment, of more ammunition. Then it went into a bad period of weather, and that impacted. Then you've done some of the wargaming and made assessments about Russia. And then in actuality, some of those Russian defenses have been stronger than first anticipated. And I think if you're in Kyiv and when you speak to General Zaluzhny, it's the fact that he's got this fleet of equipment. Some of it is ex-Soviet, some of it is from all over the world. And then his force is not a professional soldier's force. It's one that has been brought together it's a citizen army. So how do you get a citizen army to fight in the way that Ukraine is in order to overcome the Russian defenses? So I think there's a humility and sobering element to that. And then the other piece in terms of the truism is the importance of the moral and the will to fight. And I think that is a real problem for Russia, because I don't know if you've seen some of the polling surveys, the telephone polls that they do in Ukraine every couple of months. And it's extraordinary that Russia has triggered a stronger resolve in Ukraine. If you go through every region, are they pessimistic or optimistic about the future? They are optimistic about their future to the tune of 85 to 95%. You go back to last January, and when the civilian population was under pressure because of the strikes on civilians and on critical national infrastructure and some of the energy power outages, that's one of the moments when Ukraine was at its highest in terms of its determination to eject Russia from its territory. And then you see the ebbs and flows, and this summer, a Ukraine that was a net exporter of electricity. And that's where I come back to, these ebbs and flows, and trying not to get suckered into elegant plans. It's much messier. And I think when I meet General Zaluzhny, it's this realization that not only is he fighting the war, but he's also supporting President Zelensky about nationhood and keeping the state and its morale and an ambition for the state in the future, and being able to fulfill that ambition in the future. It's those things, and it's a privilege to be able to see that a bit more closely, and it's a responsibility to do our best to assist Ukraine.
Hi everybody, Mike Hoffman here. I want to take a minute to talk about the membership program War on the Rocks, where I host my personal podcast, The Russia Contingency. On my members-only show, we dive deep into Soviet and Russian military history with the world's foremost experts, and talk in depth about the latest from the war in Ukraine with my colleagues and friends. The War on the Rocks membership program also has 3 other exclusive podcasts: The Warcast, The Insider, and Unspent Rounds, which are hosted by my War on the Rocks colleagues. There's also a bi-weekly newsletter, mid-afternoon map, and a slew of new products coming soon. To sign up, head over to warontherocks.com/membership. And now back to the show.
How do you view Russia's capacity and ability to reconstitute its armed forces whenever this war either ends or freezes?
So I think Russia has got a problem to start with. So the problem it's got in this catastrophic decision, they have lost at least half the combat effectiveness of their army for very little gain. They then do a mobilization. They then do further mobilizations. Those mobilizations trigger a brain drain of nearly a million young people leaving the country. They then have to go to prisons, and they have to offer bigger incentives and more authoritarianism to get people. But they do have some advantages. They have the advantage of that autocratic control that allows them to take big decisions to shift their economy so that they can, so 30%, with big increases in their defense budget. But we've got to be really careful, because you can increase your defense budget by big amounts, but you've got to take the money from elsewhere. So 10% reductions in the rest of their budget, an economy that's under pressure, an interest rate spike in one day of 3.5% to try and prop up the ruble. And you're distorting your economy all the time. And that, to me, is where Russia is on a downward slope. And yes, they might be able to, they can increase their tank production. We thought it was going to be about 100 tanks a year. It might be closer to 200 tanks. But if you've lost over 2,000, that's a decade to get back to where you started. It's similarly with artillery shells. We think Russia's used over 10 million artillery shells last year. But its ability, it might have an ability to produce 1 to 2 million shells next year. But these are huge problems. And when you're having to distort your your economy and your society in order for a very dubious cause and what looks to be a catastrophic mistake and failure, that then creates other tensions. And you saw that because now it's had a coup attempt, Prigozhin, and then it's Ukraine is fighting back, and there are sabotage operations going on in Russia. So Moscow is, on a regular basis, Russia is now being attacked. And so you have all of these ripple effects that are happening. And so you can do things, but it's the second and third order consequences that go with it.
Let's talk about the British Armed Forces a bit. Maybe since most listeners of this show are in the United States, could you give us sort of a 101 overview of how these different strategy documents relate to each other from the integrated review to the latest command paper?
We did a very substantial review a couple of years ago called Integrated Review 2021. And that was more substantial than normal because it was taking stock of the UK having left the European Union. It was an acknowledgement that we live in a world in an extraordinary technological age. And it was also an acknowledgement that your security threats are more than just in the security domain. So it was post-COVID, and therefore there are health security aspects, and then there are also climate change security aspects. So how can you take stock of all of those? And this is about an integrated review that says that the UK will continue to be anchored in the Euro-Atlantic, and an ambition to be, and we are, the strongest European partner within NATO. But also we need to go out in the world, and that we're a P5 nation, we're a nuclear nation, we're a top 10 economy, we're a top 5 armed forces, we're a global diplomatic power, and there will be times where we want to use that. And the UK at its heart is a trading nation. And where does it get its wealth? Well, it gets its wealth from around the globe. And that was part of the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. So it's not just about the Euro-Atlantic, it's about a tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And then we've got existing responsibilities, particularly in the Gulf, both for exports and for some of our treaties and some of our long-lasting relationships. And then you've got a UK that has what we call permanent joint overseas bases. So a legacy that gives you the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic Ocean, the Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, Gibraltar, where 10% of the world's maritime traffic goes between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, Cyprus, some sovereign areas that is a phenomenal capability, Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean, a base in Bahrain, investments into Duqm in Oman, and some training areas in Kenya, some facilities in Singapore, and then as you go east, 5 powers defense agreement with our allies there, and then a couple of things that have happened since, which I think are really important in terms of shaping our future. So AUKUS, the big deal with both the US and Australia around nuclear submarines, but also some of the high-end technologies, and Global Combat Air Program, a 6th-generation fighter with Japan and Italy. So really important, Japan on the other side of the world and Italy as an EU partner for a 6th-generation fighter. So that's the sort of shape of where we are, strong in the Euro-Atlantic, but going out into the world and with a whole series of responsibilities and about a nation that is comfortable as a P5 member of the Security Council and the responsibilities that go with that.
And what were some of the highlights of the latest command paper?
So in many ways, I think it's the bravery of saying this is not going to be some big strategic document. This is not going to be a big investment moment. This is not let's adjust the force structure. It's actually much plainer, and it's about saying the things that we need to get after are stronger with people, look after our people better, be more attractive for people to come in, and part of that being a much more flexible approach to our men and women that serve. A second piece linked to that technology point, one of the lessons with the war in Ukraine is the speed of technology and the impact, and right, how do we create systems where we can invest and get that leverage and embrace technology in a stronger way. And we've got some of the fundamentals. We've got a strong science and technology base. But how do you join it to some of the other elements so you can utilize that? That then links to how do we have a stronger relationship with industry? So some bits are inevitably there's open competition, but some bits there has to be partnership. But actually, for many of us, everything is a bit too slow, too much hierarchy, too much process. Business cases take years, and that's before you start to even do something. So how can we work with industry to enable us to be an easier partner and for us to get more out of industry? And those are really important, but they're not big. They're not as big as some previous command papers, which were strategy changes or big investment changes or force structure changes. I admire the courage in not pretending that we're going to be doing big stuff and actually get after the things that will make a difference to us and our people.
Some voices in Washington, I think they're in the minority, but they represent a vocal constituency in the Republican Party, at least, express skepticism over European countries, Britain, but also France, focusing on the Indo-Pacific when there's so many major challenges in Europe. Do you think it's possible with resourcing where it is in the UK to do both?
I think it is, because the dominant piece is the Euro-Atlantic and NATO. And for the UK, that's over 90% of our force elements are earmarked to NATO. And then it's a relatively modest contribution to the Indo-Pacific. And in 21, we said we would tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And in our integrated review in 23, we said we would maintain that tilt. And that is a function of stronger relationships with Japan and Italy, a stronger relationship with South Korea, some permanent forces, maritime predominantly in the region, supplemented by carrier deployments, but also supplemented by utilizing our army and their cachet to have stronger relationships in the region, as well as our air force. And that is very doable with the force structure that we've got. And it builds on those bases I talked about. It builds on our historical relationships. It builds on our economic relationships and the likes of the Five Powers Defense Agreement, again, as a supplement to some of those other relationships. To me, I think it's one of those areas when it was announced in 21 there would be a tilt, and here we are in 23, it's about maintaining the tilt. I think that's quite an impressive record that's being pulled off at the moment.
I asked this as a, on-the-record skeptic of at least the submarine portion of the AUKUS Defense Pact, but I'm really interested in your opinion on how that's going, the pacing of it, if you're content with the trajectory, what else remains to be done in the near and midterm.
Yeah, so I can understand some skepticism because at one level, it's an audacious idea that the UK, Australia, America come together to take this exquisite technology and allow a new partnership with Australia and to become a responsible nuclear submarine propulsion power. The regulation that you have to put in place, the infrastructure, the training that needs to happen, and then the investments, because clearly nuclear submarines are incredibly expensive, that you have to sustain for tens of billions for tens of years. And we're on that path. I mean, recently America had one of its submarines in Australia as part of our carrier deployment in 21. We had one of our nuclear submarines go there. We've got some of the Australian submariners training with us. It's the same in America. The foundations of Australia, and in some areas a greenfield site to be able to build the infrastructure, to make sure it's modern infrastructure. And when you look at it for the UK, so we're a medium-sized power that is a nuclear nation, and our nuclear enterprise suffers from not having quite enough volume. So the risk is that it's more frictional than if you can increase the volume, which AUKUS provides. That then enables far more investment and that enables it all to run more smoothly. So this to me is win-win-win. It's win at a strategic level and what this means in terms of these three nations coming together. It's a win in terms of the capability that Australia will then have and need. And it's a win for the UK in terms of helping to strengthen our nuclear enterprise. And it's a win for the US as this extraordinary partner that can help both of us and has this partnership to assist with some of its responsibilities around the world. So I'm not a skeptic. I think we need more audacious ideas. The partnership that when President Modi came over, and the partnership that America is forging with India, that again to me feels it's the big ideas to respond to some of these big challenges out there, and to let's not be super canny and skeptical and not do things. Let's be ambitious and pull these things off. And our grandparents did much bigger things when they introduced nuclear, when they introduced stealth, when they introduced jet technology, and so on. So I can understand your skepticism, but I push back.
Particularly in the maritime domain, just to jump back to Russia briefly, do we see any changes in behavior, say in the Arctic or the North Sea, in terms of how Russian vessels or submarines are behaving? I know some buzzing makes the news here and there, a ship going here and there, or does Russia really just have too much on its plate?
I think it's sustaining the level of activity that most of us have seen over the last 5 years. And that's a result of Russia having invested in some areas, especially its nuclear, its underwater programs, space, cyber, its long-range missiles and bombers. And I think that's the other reason why Ukraine is so important. That, yes, Russia is weaker in a military sense in terms of the impact on its army, but this is a Russia that still has extraordinarily strong nuclear capability. And it's also got space, cyber, underwater, and these long-range missiles. And the worrying thing is that this is a Russia that is willing to use the military instrument and violence to achieve its political ends. And that we have to ensure that Russia understands that is not only not acceptable, that actually that is a flawed approach to achieve its political ends.
You were talking earlier about the command paper and finding new and better ways to take care of your people, which is critical. We're having a lot of troubles with recruitment and retention on this side of the Atlantic as well, for similar reasons, I think. What are some of the mechanisms that senior leaders in your military have with the rank and file to solicit ideas and experiences and maybe some audaciousness?
When I was the head of the Navy,
coolest title in the world.
Yeah, the First Sea Lord. Yeah. I was joking earlier today that
step down.
Chief of Defence Staff is not as my children would say, is not as cool a title, Dad. And there's always sort of generous comments in America about the title, but I can assure you the envy that Royal Navy sailors have for the US Navy and the strength and power that your CNO has is very real. But when I was head of the Navy, I went back to try to join the Navy, and it was hard. I mean, you want to serve your country, and you're willing to put on uniform, if necessary, put your neck on the line. We should be rolling out a red carpet for those individuals. It felt like it was an obstacle course. I'm not saying reduce the standards. I'm saying actually have a system that allows you to do it. I paid one of my son's friends. We were short of chefs at the time. And I paid one of my son's friends to see what it was like to join as a chef and to just get the experience. So some of it is almost just not suddenly becoming cool with the kids or whatever. We're just accepting that we've got this young population and you need to grab hold of them if they show, and you need to be able to respond and you need to reassure them and so on. So there's a bit of that. There's a bit of saying, how do you join the services? And once you're in the services, are you then stuck in and then when you leave for good? So we call it zigzag careers. So can you bring people in lateral entry? Can you go out and come back in? We have regulars, we have reservists. They're all people that are willing to serve in uniform. As some of our structures and mechanisms and these silos, and then we've all got their own individual rules, has it just become too complicated and complex? And then there's a straightforwardness about reward. And I don't just mean in pay. I mean, I mean, people feeling valued for their commitments, being well led, being well managed, a society which expects to have choice and to take its own decisions. The old patriarchy of, right, this is what you're going to do and I'm going to map out everything for you, I don't think works. And actually you've got systems, you've got digital knowledge and data and so on that allows you to put much more of these decisions in the hands of our men and women. So it's those things. And I think for senior leaders, it's about responding and breaking down some of these really tough structures and silos, and that we've always done it that way, so we're going to carry on doing it that way. And then, to your point, about unlocking the extraordinary potential that we have in the men and women who serve, who are a really high quality, and giving them the confidence and the ability to shape the organization that they're in. Because one of my biggest frustrations is that we are not unlocking the extraordinary latent potential that we have in our institutions. And it's a brilliant place to be at one level, that you've got that potential, but we're not as good as we should be at unlocking it.
One thing that I've noticed over time, we have this amazing culture here in the US where US military personnel are not just permitted, but increasingly encouraged to write for outlets like War on the Rocks or the Strategy Bridge or the Defense One, for public consumption, essentially, even though they're niche publications. That's starting to happen more in the UK, but there still seems to be a lot of cultural and even regulatory obstacles to it. The Wavel Rooms doing great work, and I'm big admirers of what they've been doing, but I feel like we need more. What are some of the challenges there, or do you disagree? Or
no, I don't. I agree. And I think it's having the confidence that somebody, and they might be quite junior, and that's a good thing because we should want to hear people's views and we should admire junior people having that passion about wanting to contribute. But we have, I don't know what it's like in America, but we have some rules that you're not allowed to offer those views publicly. And so I think there is a difference between contributing to a Wavel Room and being a senior officer that writes something that has more weight and authority to it, and that people recognize that, and that therefore these sort of straight-jacketed rules that nobody's allowed to comment or have to something that's published. I think you can have a slightly more sliding scale, and you can encourage the debate, and we should be confident enough that someone's going to take a tilt at you, and someone's going to that goes on in all organizations, but let's do it respectfully.
So maybe looser rules for people who are field grade officers or not in command and couldn't possibly be mistaken for speaking for the armed forces on that particular issue, but just giving their opinion.
I would draw the line at when it gets personal. So you're taking a tilt at an individual who, that to me is slightly different, but taking a tilt at the organization at the senior end and saying, I want this and demand, and I think we could do that to me is fine. And again, we should be confident enough. And I think we've all got histories and traditions of these kind of debates, and we're stronger for it.
I'd love to ask you about some books that have had a big influence on you throughout your career, and books that you'd recommend to other military officers.
So Ryan, let me tell you about what I think is one of the most important books in the world. Forgive me being a bit biased as a sailor. It's Mare Liberum by Hugo Grotius, who was a Dutch legal philosopher in the 1600s. And this created the high seas. And the reason why I say it's such an important book is it created the high seas and this freedom for every nation to be able to use the high seas, and that a nation's territory extended from its land to, those days, 3 miles, and then for most of the world these days, 12 miles. And I think it's really important because it's got so many similarities to some of our issues today. So it created this global commons. It created this world that can trade with each other, that can enjoy each other's prosperity. It creates a world in terms of how you look after your security, and you can stand off another's coast to influence it. But I think it's really important for what it created, and it's the fact that you can have simple rules that then endure for hundreds of years, and you can have these rules that you might need to draw upon in a similar way for space, for cyber, for all of those other global commons. So that's by my bedside at the moment. It's not an easy read, but it's the idea that I admire, and the creation of something in the 1600s that still endures today. Very, very special.
Thank you so much for doing this. It means a lot.
Great. Well, thank you, Ryan. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Please do not forget to check out our membership program. I'm revealing it here first. Our prices are actually going up soon, and we're going to be rolling out some exciting new shows and newsletters and more, adding to what we have already, which includes the Insider, Unspent Rounds, Mid-Afternoon Map, the Russia Contingency, the Warcast, the War Hall. I'm sure I'm forgetting. The app, of course. Did I mention the app that only members get access to? It's pretty cool. Anyway, sign up at warontherocks.com/membership. Lock in your annual membership before the prices go up next month. Thank you.